Hi, this is part 48, preparation for NSE4 exam, Fortinet, and how a policy match is determined. If traffic matches a firewall policy, FortiGate applies the action which is configured in the firewall policy. If the action is set to deny, FortiGate drops the session. If it's set to accept, FortiGate allows the session and applies other configured settings for packet processing, such as user authentication, source net, antivirus scanning, web filtering, and so on. When FortiGate receives traffic, it evaluates the packet's source IP address, destination address, and the requested service, protocol, and port number. It also checks the incoming interface and the outgoing interface it needs to use. Based on this information, FortiGate identifies the firewall policy and evaluates the traffic. If the traffic matches the policy, then FortiGate applies the action, accept or deny, defined in the policy. For example, to block incoming FTP traffic to all but a few FTP services, define the addresses of the FTP servers as the destination and then select FTP as a source. You probably wouldn't specify a source. Often any location on the internet is allowed, or schedule. FTP servers usually always available, day or night. And finally, set the action setting to accept. Simplify interfaces and zones. The incoming and outgoing interfaces can function as individual interfaces, or you can create a zone, which is a logical group of interfaces. To match policies with traffic, select one or more interfaces using graphical user interface, GUI, go to network interfaces. If you configure policies between port 3 LAN ingress and port 1 WAN egress, and the packet arrives on port 2, the packet will not match your policies and therefore would be dropped. To begin describing how FortiGate defines the policy for each packet, let's start with the interfaces. So if we configure policies between port 3 LAN, local area network ingress, and port 1 egress, and packet arrives on port 2, so it means that it doesn't match your policies. So it will be dropped because of the implicit deny policy at the end of the list. Even if the policy is from port 3, which is local area network ingress, to any egress, the packet would still be dropped because it doesn't match the incoming interface. To simplify policy configuration, we can group interfaces into logical zones. For example, we could group port 4 to port 7 as a DMZ. We can create zones on the interfaces page. However, if we should note that we cannot reference an interface in a zone individually. And if we need to add the interface to the zone, we must remove all references to that interface. For example, firewall policies, firewall addresses, and so on. So if we think that we might need to reference interfaces individually, we should set multiple source and destination interfaces in the firewall policy instead of using zones. Selecting multiple interfaces or any interface. By default, we can select only a single interface as the incoming interface and a single interface as an outgoing interface. This is because the option to select multiple interfaces or any interface in a firewall policy is disabled on the graphical user interface. However, we can enable the multiple interface policies option on the feature visibility page to disable single interface selection restriction. We can also specify multiple interfaces or use any options if we configure firewall policies on the command line interface CLI, regardless of the default graphical user interface setting. It is also worth mentioning that when we choose any interface option, we cannot select multiple interfaces for that interface. We cannot add any additional interfaces because any interface implies that all interfaces have already been selected. So if we choose any interface, it already includes all types of the interfaces. Matching by source. This matching criteria that FortiGate considers the packet source. In each firewall policy, we must select the source address object. Optionally, we can refine our definition of the source addresses by also selecting a user group, which provides a much more granular match for increased security. We can also select ISDB, which stands for Internet Service Database objects, as a source in the firewall policy. When we're selecting a fully qualified domain name, FQDN, as a source address, it must be resolved by DNS and cached in FortiGate. We need to make sure that FortiGate is configured properly on the DNS settings. If FortiGate is not able to resolve an FQDN address, it will present a warning message and the firewall policy configured with FQDN may not function properly. So what could be, we must specify at least one source address, IP address or range, subnet, IP and net mask, FQDN, fully qualified domain name, geography, dynamic, for example, fabric connector address, and MAC address range. And what we may specify. We may specify source user, individual or user group. This may refer to local firewall accounts, accounts on a remote server, for example, Active Directory, LDAP, Radius, FSSO, which stands for Fortinet Single Sign-On, Personal Certificate, PKI, public key infrastructure authenticated users. Next, source user authentication, user identification. If a user is added as a part of the source, FortiGate must verify the user before allowing or denying access based on the firewall policy. There are different ways that a user can authenticate. For local users, the username and password are configured locally on FortiGate. When a local user authenticates, the credentials that they enter must match the username and password, those login credentials configured locally on FortiGate. As for remote user, for example, LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, or Radius servers, FortiGate receives the username and password from the remote user and then passes the information to the authentication server. The authentication server verifies the user login credentials, it verifies username and the password, and then updates the FortiGate. After FortiGate receives that information, it grants access to the network based on the firewall policy. A Fortinet single sign-on user's information FSSO is retrieved from the domain controller. Access is granted based on the group information on FortiGate. Matching policy by source. Remember that user is an optional object. The user object is used here to make the policy more specific. For example, if we wanted the policy to match more traffic, then we would leave the user object undefined. We can also use Internet Service ISDB objects as a source in the firewall policy. There is an either or relationship between Internet Service objects and source access objects in firewall policies. This means that we can select either a source address or an Internet service, but not both. So when we go to policy and objects on graphical user interface, then we choose firewall policy. There in the graph of source, we can define address, user, and Internet service. And we can select a source address or an Internet service, but we cannot select both options. Thank you.